Two black boys were kicked out of school by a white teacher for something they didn't do. 15 years later, they walk back in, wearing suits, and one word they say makes her freeze. Asterisk, what could that word be? Stay with us to uncover a story that will leave you speechless on Real Stories Diary. Asterisk, they're not here for revenge. But what they reveal will shatter the school's legacy. Comment where you're watching from, and tell me, what would you do? Take a breath and enjoy the story on Real Stories Diary. Ms. Rachel Wright's hand trembled as she stared at the two young men standing in the principal's office doorway. Their faces, now sculpted with maturity, but unmistakably familiar, transported her back 15 years in an instant. The twins. The Marshall twins. Can education truly overcome prejudice? Or does it simply teach us to hide it better? Asterisk, imagine facing the children you wronged, now holding your future in their hands. How would you feel? Keep listening to find out on Real Stories Diary. Asterisk, the question that had haunted Rachel since that fateful spring day, when she had made the worst mistake of her 30-year teaching career. The smell of fresh paint couldn't mask the mustiness of Westbrook Academy's aging infrastructure. The once prestigious private school had fallen on hard times, with peeling wallpaper and outdated facilities telling the story of its decline more eloquently than any financial report could. Ms. Wright. Principal Matten's voice broke through her shock. I'd like you to meet Stephen and Anthony Marshall. They're the representatives of the foundation that's considering the donation that could save Westbrook. The irony was almost too perfect. The same boys she had expelled at age 8 were now standing before her as successful men in tailored suits, holding the future of the school, and by extension, her future, in their hands. Rachel had always prided herself on seeing potential in every child. Every student deserves a champion, she'd often said. Yet, when it had mattered most, she had failed these boys spectacularly. Sometimes, the person who changes your life is the one you least expect to give a second chance, Stephen said, his deep voice carrying no hint of the small, eager second grader who had once raised his hand first for every question in her class. The twins' unexpected appearance brought Rachel face to face with her greatest professional shame. In her 30 years of teaching, she had never felt more cornered than she did now, trapped between the mistakes of her past and the uncertain future they controlled. Stephen extended his hand, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. It's been a long time, Miss Wright. I believe we have some unfinished business to discuss. Rachel felt the weight of 15 years of regret as she shook his hand. The boys she had failed were now men who could determine whether Westbrook Academy, the school she had devoted her life to, would survive another year. What the twins couldn't know was how that day had changed her, too. How she had nearly resigned afterward, how she had spent years trying to make amends in ways that could never reach them. Principal Matten looked between them with confusion. You all know each other? Oh, yes. Anthony spoke for the first time, his voice gentler than his brother's, but with an unmistakable edge. Ms. Wright played a significant role in our early education. Wouldn't you say so, Miss Wright? Rachel found her voice at last, though it came out barely above a whisper. Yes. Yes, I did. What they couldn't see was how her heart was racing, her mind swirling with questions. Were they here for revenge? To publicly shame her before closing the school down anyway? Or was there something else at play? Something she couldn't yet understand? Anthony's eyes swept around the office, taking in the water stains on the ceiling, the outdated computer on the principal's desk. Things have changed since we were last here. Not everything, Stephen added, his gaze fixed firmly on Rachel. The school bell rang, signaling the end of another day at Westbrook Academy, perhaps one of its last days, unless the Marshall twins decided otherwise. As students' voices filled the hallways outside, Rachel realized something with stark clarity. The two 8-year-old boys she had wronged so many years ago now held complete power over her future. And by the look in their eyes, they hadn't forgotten a single detail of what had happened on that spring day when everything changed. What none of them realized was that someone else was watching this reunion from the hallway, someone whose role in the original incident had remained hidden all these years, and whose presence would complicate everything that was about to unfold. 15 years earlier, Rachel Wright had believed in herself as a teacher who made a difference. The cherry blossoms outside her second-grade classroom window were in full bloom that April day, their gentle scent drifting in through the cracked windows. Westbrook Academy had been in its prime then. The waitlist for admission stretched years long. The buildings freshly maintained, the reputation sterling. 8-year-old Stephen and Anthony Marshall had arrived mid-semester. Two bright-eyed boys in crisp new uniforms that their grandmother had saved for months to afford. Rachel remembered how their eyes had widened at the mahogany bookshelves, the computer stations, the science equipment, all luxuries their previous public school hadn't offered. They tested 3 grade levels above average, Principal Harmon had told her privately. Scholarship students, grandmother raised them after their parents died in a car accident when they were toddlers. They're the type of success story Westbrook's diversity initiative was designed for. Rachel had welcomed them warmly, impressed by their eager questions and quick minds. Within weeks, Stephen was excelling in mathematics, solving problems meant for 5th graders, while Anthony showed remarkable talent for writing, crafting stories that brought tears to her eyes. Ms. Wright, the voice of Principal Matten, pulled Rachel back to the present. Perhaps we should move this discussion to the conference room. Mr. Holloway will be joining us shortly. Rachel felt her stomach tighten. Gregory Holloway, the head of the school board, and the same man who, 15 years ago as a newly hired teacher, had brought the accusations against the Marshall twins. The man who had convinced her to make the worst decision of her career. As they walked down the hallway toward the conference room, Rachel noticed how the twins' eyes took in every detail of their former school. The trophy case now half empty, the paint peeling near the ceiling, the outdated technology. Westbrook Academy's decline had been slow but steady, accelerated in recent years by decreased enrollment and the economic downturn. You two were always observant, Rachel said quietly, attempting to break the tension. Stephen raised an eyebrow. A necessary skill when you're trying to figure out why adults who are supposed to protect you suddenly turn against you. The words stung with their accuracy. Inside the conference room, Anthony pulled out financial reports from his leather briefcase. Your school is 3 months away from closing permanently. The Marshall Foundation is considering a substantial endowment to keep Westbrook operating, but we have conditions. We're in no position to negotiate, Principal Matten admitted, desperation evident in her voice. She had only been principal for 2 years, inheriting a sinking ship. Whatever your conditions, we'll certainly consider them. Rachel studied the twins as they laid out documents across the table. They moved with the easy confidence of men accustomed to power. Yet she caught glimpses of the boys they had been. Anthony's habit of tilting his head when concentrating. Stephen's quick, analytical glances. The door opened, and Gregory Holloway entered. Now in his mid-40s, his once auburn hair had streaks of gray, his face lined with the strain of trying to keep the school afloat as board chairman. He stopped short when he saw the twins, recognition and shock flooding his features. You remember Mr. Holloway, don't you? Rachel couldn't keep the edge from her voice. Of course, Stephen replied smoothly. Your former colleague, the one who found his test paper with the answers written in my handwriting. Holloway paled visibly. I had no idea you were the potential donors. Clearly, Anthony replied. Please, have a seat. We were just about to explain our conditions for saving Westbrook Academy. Holloway sat slowly, exchanging a worried glance with Rachel. They both knew what the twins could reveal if they chose to. Our first condition, Stephen stated, pulling out a document, is transparency. We want a full account of what happened 15 years ago. The real story, not the official one in our records. Rachel felt her chest tighten. The official school record stated that the Marshall twins had been expelled for cheating on an important standardized test, a false accusation that had followed them to their next school. But the twins had never known the full story of why it had happened. Our second condition, Anthony continued, is the establishment of a scholarship program specifically for children from underrepresented backgrounds, with special emphasis on children being raised by grandparents or single family members. Principal Matten nodded eagerly. That sounds wonderful. We would be more than happy to. I'm not finished, Anthony interrupted gently. Our third condition is that Ms. Wright here will personally oversee the scholarship program and serve as mentor to these students. Rachel felt all eyes turn to her. The request stunned her. After what she had done, they wanted her involvement? And finally, Stephen said, his gaze shifting to Holloway, we want Mr. Holloway to publicly resign from the school board, citing personal reasons. The room fell silent. Principal Matten looked between them in confusion. I don't understand, she said finally. What exactly happened 15 years ago? Before anyone could answer, the conference room door opened again. A black woman in her 70s entered, her silver hair elegantly styled, her posture straight despite her age. Rachel recognized her immediately. Doris Marshall, the twins' grandmother. I believe I can help fill in some of those gaps, Mrs. Marshall said, her voice strong and clear. Since I was the one who begged these boys not to fight the expulsion, to just move on and prove themselves elsewhere. Mrs. Marshall set her purse on the table and looked directly at Rachel. Do you want to tell her what really happened, Ms. Wright, or shall I? The weight of 15 years of guilt pressed down on Rachel as she looked from Mrs. Marshall to the twins. They deserved the truth. Everyone in the room did. The truth, Rachel began, her voice shaking slightly, is that Gregory Holloway falsified evidence against Stephen and Anthony because he didn't believe they belonged at Westbrook. And I went along with it, even though I suspected the truth. Holloway jumped to his feet. That's a serious accusation. I won't sit here and listen to we have proof, Stephen interrupted, sliding a yellowed envelope across the table. It took us years to find it, but we did. Principal Matten reached for the envelope with trembling fingers but stopped when Mrs. Marshall spoke again. What they don't know yet, the elderly woman said, looking pointedly at Rachel, is why you went along with it when I know you cared about my boys. What did Gregory Holloway have over you that made you betray two children you had praised just days earlier? Rachel felt the blood drain from her face. The room seemed to spin slightly as the long-buried truth threatened to surface. Some secret she had thought would stay buried forever. Yes, Ms. Wright, Anthony said quietly. That's the missing piece we could never figure out. We know why he did it, racism, thinly veiled as maintaining academic standards. But you were kind to us. You encouraged us. And then, suddenly, you turned on us without a word of defense. Why? The question hung in the air, heavy and demanding. Down the hallway, the school bell rang, signaling the end of another period. Life continuing, while Rachel's past caught up with her in dramatic fashion. What no one in the room could possibly anticipate was that the answer to Anthony's question would unravel not just Rachel's carefully constructed persona, but the very foundation upon which Westbrook Academy had built its prestigious reputation for the past 50 years. Rachel stared at her hands, which were clasped so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. The silence in the conference room was deafening as everyone awaited her response. There was a photograph, Rachel finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. Gregory threatened to release it if I didn't support his accusation against the boys. Principal Matten leaned forward. A photograph of what? Rachel raised her eyes to meet Mrs. Marshall's steady gaze of me, at a civil rights protest in the 1990s. I was arrested for civil disobedience. She swallowed hard. My father was on the school board then. He made the arrest record disappear to protect the family name, but Gregory somehow found a photograph. Holloway shot to his feet. This is absurd. I never blackmailed anyone. Sit down, Greg, Rachel said with newfound strength. The twins have their evidence. I have mine. She reached into her purse and pulled out a small, yellowed envelope. I kept the note you slipped into my faculty mailbox. Your handwriting hasn't changed much. Anthony Marshall's expression softened slightly as he looked at Rachel. You were at a civil rights protest. That doesn't seem like something that would ruin your career here. You don't understand, Rachel said. My father, Mark Wright, was Westbrook's longest-serving board chairman. The Wright family has been connected to this school for generations. We present ourselves as the model of propriety and conservative values. My father built his reputation opposing the very integration that eventually brought students like you to Westbrook. So, the great defender of Westbrook tradition was secretly ashamed of his activist daughter, Stephen concluded, his analytical mind quickly connecting the dots. He would have disowned me, Rachel confirmed. And back then, I was too cowardly to stand up to him or to defend you boys when it mattered most. Mrs. Marshall shook her head slowly. All these years, I thought you were just another racist teacher who couldn't bear the thought of black children outperforming white ones. I never imagined it was something so complicated. It doesn't excuse what I did, Rachel insisted. I betrayed my principles, and I betrayed those boys. My father died 10 years ago, and I've been trying to make amends ever since, by quietly working to make Westbrook more inclusive. But it's never been enough. Principal Matten had been listening with increasing distress. Mr. Holloway, is this true? Did you falsify evidence against 2 8-year-old boys and blackmail Ms. Wright to support your lies? Before Holloway could respond, Stephen slid the envelope across the table. See for yourself. Inside was a faded worksheet with mathematical problems. At the top was Stephen's name, written in a childish scrawl, but the answers were clearly written in an adult's handwriting, attempting to mimic a child's. I kept a copy of all my schoolwork, Stephen explained. My grandmother taught us to document everything. The original of this was supposedly found in Mr. Holloway's classroom after hours, with answers to his upcoming test. But I never wrote this. Holloway's face had gone from pale to crimson. You can't prove I wrote that. Actually, Anthony said, modern forensic handwriting analysis can. The Marshall Foundation has considerable resources now, Mr. Holloway. Would you like us to pursue that avenue? Holloway sank back into his chair, defeated. Mrs. Marshall placed her worn hands flat on the table. What I still don't understand is why. Why target my boys specifically? Rachel and Holloway exchanged a glance, and Rachel realized, with sickening clarity, that there was yet another layer to the story, one that even she hadn't fully understood until this moment. It wasn't just about the boys being black, was it, Greg? Rachel asked quietly. It was about their test scores, about what would happen if word got out that 2 black scholarship students from a poor neighborhood were outperforming the children of Westbrook's wealthiest donors. Holloway's silence was confirmation enough. Several board members approached me discreetly, he finally admitted. They were concerned about what Stephen and Anthony's exceptional performance might suggest about intelligence and opportunity, about nature versus nurture. They were afraid we'd prove that, given equal opportunity, the myth of inherent superiority would crumble, Stephen said, his voice tight with controlled anger. That's why my recommendation for accelerated placement was denied, Rachel realized aloud. Not just for you two, but for any scholarship student who showed exceptional promise. Anthony's expression was thoughtful. So, this was policy, not just a personal vendetta. Systematic. I was told it was about maintaining standards and protecting the school's reputation, Holloway said defensively. Parents were threatening to withdraw their children and their donations. Mrs. Marshall's laugh was without humor. So, instead of celebrating my grandchildren's gifts, you destroyed their academic records and forced them out to protect the fragile egos of wealthy white parents and their mediocre children. The harsh truth of her words hung in the air. Principal Matten looked nauseated. As the current principal, I want to formally apologize. Save it, Stephen interrupted. Apologies don't change the past. Actions might change the future. Rachel looked at the twins with new eyes. Despite everything, they had succeeded. They had built something significant enough that they could now return as potential saviors to the very institution that had betrayed them. What happened to you both after Westbrook? She asked softly. Anthony exchanged a glance with his grandmother. It wasn't easy. The cheating accusation followed us. 3 schools rejected us before we found one that would take a chance. Mariah Taylor, Mrs. Marshall said with reverence, a retired public school teacher who started a small community school in our neighborhood. She saw through the lies immediately. She changed our lives, Stephen added. Taught us not just academics, but how to navigate a system built to exclude us. When she died 5 years ago, she left us her modest savings with a note that said, "Build something that will outlast injustice." The Marshall Foundation was her vision as much as ours, Anthony explained. We started with a small tutoring program in her living room. Now, we have educational initiatives in 12 states. Rachel felt tears burning behind her eyes. She did what I should have done. Yes, Stephen agreed simply. Principal Matten cleared her throat. I'm still unclear about your intentions here. You've exposed a terrible injustice from Westbrook's past, but you're also offering to save the school. Why? The twins looked at each other, communicating silently in that way that only twins can. Because closing Westbrook punishes the wrong people, Anthony finally answered. The current students don't deserve to lose their school because of the sins of the past. And transformation is more powerful than destruction, Stephen added. We want to remake Westbrook into what it should have been all along, a place where excellence is nurtured, regardless of a student's background. Mrs. Marshall reached out and took one of her grandson's hands in each of hers. These boys never wanted revenge. They wanted justice. There's a difference. Rachel found herself nodding. Your conditions, the scholarship program, the mentorship, those aren't punishments. They're opportunities for redemption. For the school, Stephen clarified. And perhaps for you, Ms. Wright, if you're willing to do the work. A knock at the door interrupted them. A young teacher poked her head in. I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's someone else here who insists on being part of this meeting. He says he was on the school board 15 years ago and has information relevant to the Marshall case. The door opened wider to reveal an elderly man leaning on a cane, his face lined with age, but his eyes sharp and determined. That's Doug Foster, Holloway whispered, his face draining of color once more. He was board treasurer when all this happened. He resigned suddenly right after. Let him in, Mrs. Marshall said, her expression suggesting she recognized the name. As Foster limped into the room, he locked eyes with the twins, then with Rachel. I've been waiting 15 years for this day, he said gravely. There's more to this story than even Ms. Wright knows. Much more. The atmosphere in the room shifted yet again as everyone realized that the full truth, the truth that could either heal or destroy Westbrook Academy once and for all, was about to be revealed. Doug Foster lowered himself carefully into a chair at the conference table. Though his body showed the frailty of age, his eyes remained sharp and alert as they swept across the faces gathered around him. I've been following the Marshall Foundation's work for years, he said, nodding respectfully toward the twins, waiting for the day your path might cross with Westbrook again. When I heard about the potential donation, I knew that day had finally come. Mr. Foster resigned from the board about a month after your expulsion, Rachel explained to the twins. He never said why. I resigned because I couldn't be part of a system that would destroy two children's futures to protect its own reputation, Foster replied, his voice gaining strength. But I was a coward who resigned quietly instead of fighting publicly. Mrs. Marshall studied the elderly man. I remember your name. You called me once, about a year after the boys were expelled. You said there had been a terrible mistake, but when I asked for details, you said your hands were tied by legal agreements. Foster nodded solemnly. The non-disclosure agreement they made me sign when I left the board. It expired 5 years ago, but by then, I couldn't find you. You'd moved. After what happened at Westbrook, I was determined to get my boys away from this neighborhood and its painful memories, Mrs. Marshall explained. We started fresh across town. Anthony leaned forward. What exactly do you know, Mr. Foster? The elderly man reached into his jacket and pulled out a thin folder. I was treasurer of the board when you boys were admitted to Westbrook. What no one has mentioned yet is that your scholarships weren't just ordinary diversity scholarships. They were part of a federal grant program. Principal Matten frowned. Federal grant? Westbrook received a substantial federal grant that year, nearly $2 million, earmarked specifically for bringing exceptional students from underserved communities into elite private educational settings, Foster explained. The Marshall twins were the flagship students of this program. Holloway shifted uncomfortably in his seat as Foster continued. The grant required extensive documentation of the students' progress. When Stephen and Anthony began demonstrating extraordinary aptitude, it actually strengthened Westbrook's position for the next round of funding. Rachel's confusion was evident. But then, why would anyone want them removed? That makes no sense financially. Foster's expression darkened. Because certain board members, including Mark Wright, he nodded toward Rachel, your father, had already diverted most of those funds away from their intended purpose. The revelation hit Rachel like a physical blow. My father embezzled federal grant money? Not exactly embezzled, Foster clarified. Repurposed. The money went into Westbrook's general building fund instead of toward the specialized programs and additional resources that were supposed to be created for the scholarship students. The East Wing renovation, Rachel whispered, the pieces falling into place. That's why it happened so suddenly that year. The board announced it as an anonymous donation. The problem, Foster continued, was that federal auditors were scheduled to visit at the end of that school year to evaluate the grant program's success. If they discovered that the Marshall twins were thriving academically, but that the promised resources had never been created, there would have been serious consequences, possibly criminal charges. So, we weren't expelled because we were outperforming wealthy students, Stephen said slowly. We were expelled because our success would have exposed financial fraud. Both reasons were factors, Foster admitted, but yes, the financial issue was the driving force. If you were expelled for cheating, the grant requirements would consider you failed participants in the program, and no one would look too closely at where the money had gone. Holloway's face had gone ashen. I didn't know about the financial aspect. Mark Wright just told me the boys needed to be removed before they caused problems for the legacy families. He implied their parents might withdraw their children. And you were ambitious enough to do his dirty work, Mrs. Marshall observed coldly. Principal Matten looked stunned. This goes beyond an unjust expulsion. This was criminal. Yes, Foster agreed simply. But the statute of limitations has long since expired. Rachel's hands trembled as she processed this new information about her father. The man who had raised her to believe in family honor and tradition had conspired to destroy two innocent children to cover up his own wrongdoing. Anthony fixed his gaze on Foster. What exactly did they do with the grant money that was meant for us and other scholarship students? In addition to the building renovations, there were several administrative retreats to luxury resorts, new vehicles for senior administrators, and substantial bonuses for board members who also served in paid positions, Foster explained, opening his folder and sliding several photocopied documents across the table. Including my father, Rachel noted, her voice hollow as she recognized his signature on the paperwork. Yes, Foster confirmed. As both board chairman and director of legacy relations, he received over $150,000 in performance bonuses that year. Mrs. Marshall's expression was one of controlled fury. So, my grandsons were just collateral damage in a financial scheme. They were more than that, Foster said, his voice gentle but firm. They were threats. Their extraordinary performance drew attention. Teachers were noticing, parents were talking, and eventually, someone would have asked why these two brilliant boys weren't receiving the specialized resources that the grant had specified. Rachel looked at the twins with fresh anguish. I had no idea the situation went this deep. I thought it was just Gregory's prejudice and my father's obsession with tradition. Your father was the architect, Foster confirmed. Holloway was just a convenient tool. Holloway stood up abruptly. I won't sit here and be called a tool. I made a terrible mistake, yes, but I didn't know about the financial fraud. I was manipulated, too. And yet, you were promoted to department head the following year, Foster pointed out, with a substantial salary increase. The twins had been conferring quietly between themselves during this exchange. Now, Stephen spoke up. We have a decision to make about our donation, he said, his tone businesslike. In light of this new information, Anthony and I need to discuss our options. Principal Matten looked panicked. Please, I understand your hesitation, but the current administration had nothing to do with these past wrongs. Today's students shouldn't be punished. We agree, Anthony assured her. But our conditions may need to be adjusted. A knock at the door interrupted them again. An administrative assistant poked her head in. I'm sorry, but there are several reporters in the front office asking about the Marshall Foundation's donation. Someone tipped them off that you're here. Holloway immediately stood up. I should speak with them and control the narrative before. Sit down, Greg, Rachel said firmly. You've done enough damage. The assistant looked uncertain. What should I tell them? All eyes turned to the Marshall twins. Stephen made a decision. Tell them we'll issue a statement in 1 hour. After the assistant left, Mrs. Marshall reached for her grandson's hands. Boys, what are you thinking? We're thinking, Anthony said carefully, that there's an opportunity here for something more important than just saving a school. The truth, Stephen added. After 15 years, maybe it's time for the whole truth to come out. Rachel felt a chill run through her. That would destroy Westbrook's reputation completely. The school wouldn't survive the scandal, donation or not. Perhaps Westbrook Academy, as it exists, shouldn't survive, Anthony suggested. But something new could rise in its place. Foster nodded slowly. You're thinking of a complete restructuring. We're thinking, Stephen clarified, that the Marshall Foundation could do more than just donate money. We could acquire Westbrook entirely. The boldness of the proposal stunned everyone into silence. A hostile takeover of a private school? Principal Matten finally managed. Not hostile, Anthony corrected. Given the financial situation, the board would have little choice but to accept a reasonable offer. Rachel felt a strange mixture of dread and hope. What would you do with it? Stephen's expression softened slightly. Transform it into what it pretended to be 15 years ago, a place of genuine educational opportunity for all gifted students, regardless of background. With no secrets and no corruption at its foundation, Anthony added, as the implications of their plan sank in. A commotion could be heard from the hallway. The conference room door burst open without warning, and a distinguished-looking older man in an expensive suit strode in, flanked by 2 younger men who were clearly lawyers. What the hell is going on here? He demanded. The board wasn't informed about any meeting with the Marshall Foundation representatives. Rachel recognized him immediately. Matt Whitfield, current board chairman and my father's oldest friend. Whitfield looked around the room, his gaze hardening when he saw Foster. When his eyes landed on the twins, a flash of recognition crossed his face, quickly replaced by calculated neutrality. Mr. Marshall, he acknowledged stiffly. I understand your foundation is considering a donation. I'm afraid any discussions about financial matters must include the board. Perfect timing, Mr. Whitfield, Stephen replied with a cold smile. We were just discussing the board's involvement in certain financial decisions, specifically decisions made 15 years ago regarding federal grant money. Whitfield's expression didn't change, but Rachel, watching closely, saw the slight tightening around his eyes. He knew. He had been on the board then, too. The room crackled with tension as everyone realized that the final confrontation, the one that would determine not just the fate of the Marshall twins' donation, but the very future of Westbrook Academy, was about to begin. Matt Whitfield remained standing, his authoritative presence filling the room. His eyes darted to the documents on the table, Foster's evidence of the financial misconduct from 15 years ago. I see Doug has been sharing his theories again, Whitfield said with forced casualness. Always the alarmist, weren't you, Doug? Not theories, Matt. Documentation. Foster tapped the folder. I was treasurer. I kept copies of everything. A flicker of concern crossed Whitfield's face before he regained his composure. Ancient history. Hardly relevant to today's discussion about the Marshall Foundation's generous offer. Stephen leaned back in his chair, studying Whitfield with the analytical gaze that had made him a formidable business strategist. On the contrary, Mr. Whitfield, the past is extremely relevant to our current negotiations. Whitfield turned to Principal Matten. I